This 1924 graduation photo looks inspiring until you notice who is missing. At first glance, it seemed like any other commencement portrait from a segregated Southern school. The graduates wore their caps and gowns with quiet pride. Teachers stood at the edges with careful smiles. But Dr. Renée Harris could not shake the feeling that something in the composition felt wrong. The empty space in the front row kept pulling her attention back. Harris worked as an archivist at Emory University's Special Collections Library, and in 17 years of cataloging photographs, she had developed an eye for absence. This image had arrived in a donation from the estate of a former Atlanta photographer, part of a larger collection documenting black institutions in the city during the 1920s. The photo itself was mounted in heavy cardboard, the kind studio photographers used for formal portraits. The school's name was embossed along the bottom: Washington High School, Colored Division, Class of 1924. She brought the image to her desk and switched on the LED magnifier. 11 students occupied the frame. They were arranged in 2 rows on the front steps of a brick building, the young men in dark suits beneath their gowns, the young women in white blouses. 2 teachers flanked them, a man and a woman, both holding diplomas. The composition was standard, the lighting good, the focus sharp. But that gap in the front row, between 2 young women, was too wide to be accidental. It was exactly the width of one more person. Harris flipped the mounting board over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a list of names. She counted them. 12 names. 12 graduates listed, but only 11 faces in the photograph. Next to the 12th name, Elijah Marsh, someone had written in darker ink, "Withdrawn for work." This was not just an old picture. Something here was wrong. Harris had spent nearly 2 decades sorting through Atlanta's photographic memory. She had seen thousands of images from the Jim Crow era, and she knew how to read what was not shown. Photographs from segregated schools were meant to project dignity and progress, to demonstrate to white funders and skeptical observers that black education was producing respectable citizens. Every element was deliberate. A missing graduate was not just an absence. It was a disruption of the entire message. She removed the photograph from its mounting board with archival tweezers and examined the studio mark embossed in the lower right corner. E.M. Ball Photography, 214 Auburn Avenue. She pulled out the accompanying ledger that had come with the estate donation, a leather-bound log where the photographer recorded each sitting. On the page dated May 18, 1924, she found the entry: Washington High School Graduation Group, 12 students, paid by school board. And then, in different handwriting, squeezed into the margin, 1 absent day of sitting, C note. There was no note. Harris sat back and let the implications settle. Someone had been expected, someone had been paid for, someone had not shown up, and then their name had been crossed through with a bureaucratic explanation that felt more like an erasure than a clarification. The more she looked at that empty space in the front row, the more it looked like a wound in the image itself. If she walked away now, Elijah Marsh would remain a penciled addendum, a student who simply did not make it to picture day. But Harris had learned that these small, disappeared moments were often the ones that mattered most. The obvious starting point was the school itself. Washington High School had been the first public high school for black students in Atlanta, opened in 1924 after years of community organizing and pressure on the city board. Harris cross-referenced the city directory from that year and found the school's location on what was then the southern edge of the 4th Ward. The building no longer existed. It had been demolished in the 1960s during urban renewal, that polite term for the systematic destruction of black neighborhoods. She moved to the census records. The 1920 census listed an Elijah Marsh, age 14, living on Decatur Street with his mother, Lucy Marsh, a laundress, and 2 younger sisters. The father's name was absent. The household was marked as Negro, the occupation listed as none for Elijah, which meant he was still in school at that time. By 1930, the next available census, there was no Elijah Marsh at that address. Lucy Marsh was still there, still working as a laundress, but her son had vanished from the official record. Harris contacted Dr. Maurice Chen, a historian at Georgia State University who specialized in black education during Jim Crow. They met at a coffee shop near the campus, and she showed him the photograph and the ledger entry. Chen studied the image in silence, then looked up. "Withdrawn for work. That phrasing shows up constantly in school records from this period. It was the polite way of saying the family needed income or the student had no choice. He tapped the empty space in the photo. But here's what's strange. Washington High in 1924 was brand new. Getting admitted was competitive. Families fought to get their kids in because it was one of the few paths to a better future. A student who made it all the way to graduation week would not just walk away. Harris asked if there were any records from the school itself. Chen shook his head. Most of them were lost when the building was torn down. But the Atlanta Board of Education archives might have enrollment records or correspondence. And if you really want to dig, check the city's budget documents. School funding for black institutions was always a shell game. You might find something in the fine print. Over the next 2 weeks, Harris worked through the city archives. The Washington High enrollment records for 1924 were incomplete, but she found Elijah Marsh's name on the list of seniors. His attendance had been nearly perfect through March. Then, starting in early April, he was marked absent more days than present. On May 2nd, 2 weeks before graduation, a notation appeared, released per board agreement. The phrase board agreement was bureaucratic and vague, the kind of language designed to obscure rather than clarify. Harris searched the Board of Education meeting minutes from the spring of 1924. Most of the entries were tedious summaries of budget line items and curriculum approvals. But on April 10th, she found a single paragraph that made her pause. Discussion of supplemental funding arrangement with Southern Railway Company for maintenance of colored school facilities. Agreement terms accepted. Superintendent to coordinate with company representatives regarding eligible students. She read it 3 more times. Eligible students. The school system had made some kind of arrangement with the railroad, and students were part of it. This was not about scholarship programs or apprenticeships. The language was too careful, too deliberately bland. Harris pulled the photograph closer, studying the faces of the 11 students who had been allowed to stay. Their expressions were composed, the way people arranged their faces for formal portraits in that era. But now she saw something else. The 2 students flanking the empty space, both young women, were not looking at the camera. Their eyes were slightly downcast, their shoulders angled inward. They knew. They knew who should have been standing between them. The next thread led her to the archives of the Atlanta History Center, where corporate records from the Southern Railway Company were housed. It took 3 visits and a letter from her department chair to gain access to the personnel files. Railroad companies in the 1920s kept meticulous records because labor was the biggest expense after equipment, and every worker had to be accounted for. She found Elijah Marsh in a ledger dated April 1924, listed under track maintenance crew, temporary assignment, Negro. The notation included his age, 17, and his point of origin, via municipal arrangement, Atlanta. His pay rate was listed as 60 cents per day, far below the standard $1.20 paid to adult track workers. The assignment location was a section of line running through rural Georgia, between Macon and Albany, a stretch notorious for summer heat and minimal oversight. 3 pages later, she found a carbon copy of a letter from the railroad's regional superintendent to the Atlanta Board of Education. The letter was dated March 15, 1924, 1 month before Elijah disappeared from school. As per our ongoing agreement, we request the assignment of 6 able-bodied colored youths for track maintenance, term of 4 months minimum. Payment of $200 per head to be remitted to the city upon delivery. Preference for students age 16 to 18, sound health, no criminal record, transportation and supervision to be provided by company. Harris sat very still. $200 per student. That was not a wage. That was a purchase price. The city of Atlanta, through its Board of Education, was selling black students to the railroad, and they were using the language of contracts and agreements to disguise it as something legitimate. She needed to understand the scale. Over the next week, she cross-referenced the school records with the railroad's personnel logs. Between 1923 and 1928, she found 37 names, 37 students from Washington High and 2 other black schools in Atlanta who were marked released per board agreement in the spring of their final year. Most were 17 or 18 years old, all male. Most came from single-parent households where the mother worked as a domestic servant or laundress. None of them graduated, and all of them appeared in the Southern Railway payroll records within a month of leaving school. The system was clear. The school system identified students who were academically promising but economically vulnerable. The railroad offered funding for school facilities, new desks, textbooks, building repairs, money the segregated schools desperately needed. In exchange, the city provided young laborers at below-market wages. The families were told their sons were being given work opportunities. The students were told it was temporary. But the contracts, when Harris finally found them buried in the railroad's legal files, bound the workers for a minimum of 6 months, with provisions that extended the term if any debt was incurred. It was peonage, the same system that had replaced slavery across the South after emancipation. And it was happening in 1924, in Atlanta, with the full knowledge of the city government. Harris traveled south to the area where the track crews had worked. The rail line was still active, but the labor camps were long gone. She walked along the embankment on a humid afternoon, watching the freight trains rumble past. A local historian she had contacted met her at a crossroads near what had once been the campsite. His name was James Odom, and he had grown up hearing stories about the railroad camps from his grandfather, who had worked on a section crew in the 1930s. Odom was in his 70s now, a retired teacher with a careful way of speaking. "My grandfather said there were always young boys out there who should have been in school," Odom told her as they walked. "He called them the spring recruits because they showed up every April or May, right when the schools let out. Except they did not come back when school started again. The railroad said it was all legal, that the families had signed papers. But nobody ever saw those papers." Harris asked if he knew what the work conditions were like. Odom nodded. "Brutal. Track work in Georgia summer, you're talking about 100-degree heat, swinging a sledgehammer or hauling rail ties. The boys were fed, barely, and housed in shanty cars that ran along the line. If you got hurt, and people got hurt all the time, there was no doctor. If you tried to leave, they docked your pay for the cost of your transport and your food, and suddenly you owed more than you had earned. Debt peonage, just like the convict lease system." He paused at a place where the embankment widened. There was a cemetery about a quarter-mile from here. Company cemetery, for workers who died on the job, mostly unmarked graves. My grandfather said a lot of those boys never made it home. Harris felt the weight of it settle in her chest. Elijah Marsh had been 2 weeks from graduating high school, from holding a diploma that might have opened a door to something better. Instead, the city had sold him to the railroad, and he had vanished into the same brutal labor system that had consumed black workers for generations. The empty space in the graduation photo was not just an absence, it was a theft. Back in Atlanta, Harris began the work of making the story public. She scheduled a meeting with the director of the university's library, Dr. Angela Whitmore, and the head of special collections. She brought the photograph, the school records, the railroad ledgers, and the payment agreements. She laid them out on the conference table in order, building the narrative piece by piece. Whitmore listened without interrupting. When Harris finished, the director sat back and looked at the photograph for a long time. "This is going to be difficult," she said finally. "The university has relationships with the railroad. We have donors whose families were involved in Southern Railway. And frankly, this makes the city government look complicit in something very close to slavery, 50 years after emancipation." Harris had expected this. It makes them look complicit because they were complicit. This is not speculation. These are the city's own records. The head of special collections, an older white man named Bartlett, cleared his throat. "I'm not disputing the facts, but we need to think about how this will be received. A single photograph, one missing student, 37 names over 5 years. Is it enough to justify an entire exhibition? Will people see this as a pattern or an isolated incident?" Harris kept her voice level. 37 students is not isolated, and this is not just about them. This is about a system where black children were treated as a municipal resource, where education was conditional, where promising futures were traded for funding. That system was everywhere. We are just documenting one corner of it. Whitmore tapped the photograph. "What would you want to do with this?" Harris had thought about this carefully. A small exhibition in the library's public gallery, the photograph as the centerpiece, with context panels explaining what we found, copies of the key documents. And we try to contact descendants. If Elijah Marsh has family still in Atlanta, they deserve to know what happened to him. There was a long silence. Finally, Whitmore nodded. Do it. But we need to be transparent about the gaps. We do not know for certain what happened to Elijah Marsh after he left the railroad. We do not know if he survived. We document what we can prove, and we are honest about what we cannot. It took 4 months to build the exhibition. Harris worked with a graduate assistant to create context panels that explained the economic pressures on black schools, the legal loopholes that made peonage possible, and the broader history of coerced labor in the South. They enlarged the photograph so visitors could see the empty space clearly, and they included a copy of the ledger page with Elijah's name crossed out. The hardest part was finding the family. Harris searched through probate records, death certificates, and church membership rolls. She eventually found a living descendant, Elijah's great-niece, a woman named Claudia Freeman, who lived in College Park, just south of Atlanta. Freeman was in her 60s, a retired postal worker. She had never heard of her great-uncle. They met at Freeman's home on a Saturday afternoon. Harris brought copies of everything she had found. Freeman looked through the documents slowly, her hands trembling slightly when she reached the photograph. This empty space. That is him? That should have been him, Harris said. He was 2 weeks from graduating. Freeman stared at the image. My grandmother, that was his sister, she used to talk about how smart Elijah was. She said he was going to be a teacher, but she never said what happened to him. I always thought he must have died young, maybe in an accident. I didn't know about any of this. Harris walked her through the records, explaining the agreement between the school board and the railroad, the payment, the labor camps. Freeman listened without speaking, her jaw tight. When Harris finished, Freeman looked up. They sold him. Yes. And the city just let it happen. The city arranged it. Freeman was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I want people to know. I want his name back in that picture where it belongs. The exhibition opened in October. It was modest, just one gallery wall, but the photograph was displayed at eye level, impossible to miss. The title card read, Elijah Marsh, class of 1924, Washington High School, withdrawn for work. Below it, in smaller text, one of at least 37 black students removed from Atlanta schools between 1923 and 1928 and sent to work on Southern Railway track crews under agreements between the city and the railroad company. The response was immediate. Local journalists picked up the story. A reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote a feature that ran on the front page of the Metro section. Historians and educators across the city began searching their own archives for similar patterns. The Atlanta Board of Education issued a statement acknowledging the troubling practices of a prior era and promising to review its historical records for other instances of coerced labor. Claudia Freeman attended the opening reception. She stood in front of the photograph for a long time, studying the faces of the students who had been allowed to graduate, the teachers who had presided over a ceremony that pretended everything was normal. When Harris joined her, Freeman said, I keep thinking about how many people had to sign off on this, the school board, the superintendent, the railroad executives. How many signatures does it take to steal a child's future? Harris did not have an answer. The exhibition included a copy of the payment agreement, and she had counted the signatures, 14 officials, none of whom faced any consequence. The bureaucratic language had protected them, turned theft into procedure, coercion into coordination. Elijah Marsh had become a line item. Over the next few months, more descendants came forward. A grandson of one of the other missing students brought in letters his grandfather had written from the labor camp, describing the heat and the exhaustion and the constant fear of injury. A church archivist in Macon provided membership records that listed 3 young men who had joined the congregation briefly in 1925, all of them from Atlanta, all of them working for the railroad, all of them gone by the following year. The pattern was wider than Harris had initially documented. The system had been efficient, organized, and almost invisible. One afternoon, Harris received an email from a researcher at the National Archives. He had been following the exhibition coverage and decided to search the files of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which had regulated railroads during that period. He found a complaint filed in 1927 by a black minister in Atlanta, alleging that the Southern Railway was using coerced labor and that the city government was facilitating it. The complaint had been dismissed without investigation. The reason given? Insufficient evidence of federal jurisdiction. The system had protected itself at every level. When challenged, it deflected. When exposed, it minimized. And when confronted decades later, it offered statements of regret that carefully avoided admissions of culpability. Harris updated the exhibition with the new findings. The story was no longer just about one missing student. It was about an entire generation of black youth whose educations had been interrupted, whose futures had been stolen, whose absence from the official record was the result of deliberate policy. The photograph remained at the center, but now visitors understood what that empty space truly represented. It was not an accident of scheduling or a family emergency. It was the visible scar of a system designed to exploit. The exhibition stayed up for 6 months, longer than originally planned. On the final day, Harris stood in the gallery and watched visitors move through the space. Some read every panel carefully, leaning in to study the documents. Others stood silently in front of the photograph, counting the students, noticing the gap. A teacher brought a group of high school students, and Harris heard them whispering to each other, their voices tight with anger. This was what photographs could do when you learned to read them correctly. They were not neutral records. They were stages, carefully arranged to communicate power and propriety. The composition of the Washington High graduation photo was meant to show progress, dignity, achievement. But the empty space betrayed the performance. It showed what the frame tried to hide, the violence required to maintain the illusion of order. Harris thought about the hundreds of similar photographs in archives across the South, images of schools and churches and community gatherings, all of them framed to suggest stability and progress. How many of them contained similar absences? How many names had been crossed out, withdrawn, released per agreement, lost to arrangement no one wanted to explain? The work of rereading these images was just beginning. Every formal portrait from the Jim Crow era was a site of potential excavation, a place where the official narrative might crack open to reveal what had been buried beneath. The students who were allowed to stand in the front row, who were permitted to hold their diplomas for the camera, had their own stories. But the ones who were missing, the ones whose names appeared in ledgers but not in images, were the ones who testified most clearly to the machinery of exploitation. Elijah Marsh never graduated from Washington High School. He never became a teacher. The record suggested he worked for the Southern Railway until the fall of 1924, when his name disappeared from the payroll logs. There was no death certificate, no record of return to Atlanta, no trace of what happened next. His great-niece placed flowers at the exhibition in front of the empty space where he should have been standing. It was a small gesture, inadequate and necessary. The photograph stayed in the university's permanent collection, and Harris made sure it was cataloged with the full context. Researchers who encountered it in the future would not see an inspiring image of black achievement. They would see evidence of a system that traded children for funding, that used bureaucratic language to disguise coercion, that erased resistance by calling it withdrawal. There are thousands of photographs like this one, sitting in archives and attics and historical societies, waiting for someone to notice what is missing. The empty spaces, the awkward gaps, the names that do not match the faces, they are not mistakes. They are scars, and reading them is one way of insisting that the people who were erased still matter, that their stolen futures still demand an accounting, that the machinery of exploitation cannot be allowed to hide behind the language of procedure and agreement. Every time someone looks at that graduation photo, now, they will count 11 faces and know there should be 12. They will see the empty space and understand it as a theft. And they will ask the question Harris learned to ask, the one that opens the door to all the buried stories. Who is missing and why?